I'm your host, Soraya Sinozie, and this is Diaspora and Development, where we give voice to people of the diaspora working in international development. In honor of Caribbean Heritage Month, my guest today is Dr. Adelle Thomas, Adaptation Lead at the National Resource Defense Council and Vice Chair of Working Group 2 for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. As a human environment geographer, her areas of research focus on climate change adaptation, limits to adaptation, and loss and damage in the developing world, with a particular focus on small island developing states. She made history by becoming the first English-speaking Caribbean scientist and first female Caribbean scientist to be elected to the panel. Adelle has over 16 years of practice in the intersections between climate action and development. Adelle holds a PhD and master's degree in geography, a BS in civil engineering, and a BA in engineering science.
Thank you for joining us, Adelle. Let's get into it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
With pleasure. Adelle, what was your childhood like growing up in the Bahamas? And how did it influence what you're doing now?
Yeah, so that's always a great place to start. So I grew up in Nassau, Bahamas, which, a very small island, small population. And I was exposed to and saw lots of different parts of society. So, from people that were extremely poor, people just getting by, middle class, wealthy. And it really helped me to understand the different challenges that face different types of people. And also it helped me to understand how quickly you could move from one category to another. So as a child, I went from living on Paradise Island, which is like the bougie, wealthy area, to living with my grandparents in a very modest community. And just that change allowed me to see so many different parts of society. It also instilled in me a really strong sense of independence, knowing that I was responsible for carving out the type of life that I wanted. It gave me a strong work ethic and determination. And it really, broadened my lens in seeing the world through different viewpoints.
Talk to me a little bit more about this sense of independence.
Yeah. So, I knew from a young age that I had to rely on what I could do. And so it instilled in me, you need to figure out what it is that you want to do, and you need to do that because you don't have like a safety net to fall back into. And so it made me very self-reliant. And I think that's something that I carried throughout my career.
Cool. Thank you. And tell us about your career trajectory. You first studied engineering and then geography, receiving your doctorate in 2012, I believe. What led to the change from engineering to geography? Was there a aha moment?
Yeah. So I chose engineering in the first place because it was the quickest degree that you could do and still make good money coming out with a bachelor's. So it wasn't something like medicine or law where you had to go on and do graduate work. You could come out with your bachelor's and actually make money, and not something like a bachelor's in geography. You couldn't come out with that and make money. So I was very much like, I need to do my bachelor's in something that I'm going to get paid for. So I chose engineering. I was also good at math and physics, so it was a good fit. And then I worked for a while doing engineering, doing construction project management, all male fields, predominantly white fields. And I was bored. I was like, I cannot see myself doing this for the rest of my life. And I was like, I'm smarter than this. So,
That's good. So you're smarter than this. And then also very smart in terms of you chose a degree that you could start right away. Well, yours truly chose political science. You couldn't do something with it right away. And why were you bored?
I was bored. I was working for a major corporation, and it was doing like remodels and new builds. And the people who had been in it for so long that they knew with their eyes closed what the plans were and what needed to be done. And I was like, I don't want to be an expert in that. Like, that's not what I want to do. And I went to a liberal arts for my undergraduate. So I saw people that were doing like cool degrees, but I was like, that's not going to make any money. So after I came out and I was like, okay, this is not cutting it. Then I said, okay, let me go into geography, because I had done some geography in undergrad and it was super interesting and also really broad, because in geography, you basically study whatever you want once it has some type of spatial component to it. So I deliberately chose a field that was really broad that would allow me to have different interests throughout my career.
Cool. In some previous episodes, we've talked to members of the diaspora having a different perspective when it comes to development. As a member of the Bahamian diaspora and the larger Caribbean diaspora, what different perspective do you bring to your work in climate change?
I think I bring the experience of someone who has had direct impacts and direct experience, right? So I remember as a child going through Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and, having to go into the bathroom, into the tub, because that was the strongest room in the house, and being in there and hearing the storm outside. And, we had our loaves of bread and our candle, and that's what we had to get us through. And so I think having that direct lived experience of not having much resources, having to live through the type of impacts the climate change and now having to so many people, it allows me to have a better understanding of the type of policies and strategies that are needed, rather than somebody who's coming from it having never actually experienced anything. Having volunteered after a hurricane and seeing people who lost everything, kids who have, nowhere to go. It's a much deeper personal connection. And I think that empathy helps me in having the motivation to do the type of work that I do, and a deeper insight into, this makes sense or this really isn't helping anybody.
Yes, I can see that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was founded in 1988. You're the first English Caribbean and the first female Caribbean scientist to be elected to that panel. What has your experience been so far?
Yeah. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, it's the most well-known international scientific body that does assessments of climate change research. So it's a huge deal. I was elected last July, so July 2023, to be on the Bureau. My experience so far has been really eye-opening. There are things that you could do on the Bureau that you can't do if you're not. So like helping to shape what it is that we're studying, helping to shape what the reports look like. It's a huge honor to be elected. So all 190-some countries were the ones that did the election. So it's great to be, setting first there. It's also great to be an inspiration for other young scientists, young women, female, coming from the Caribbean, to see that you can also be in these positions. The voice that you have is so important to diversify, the same set of people always making policies. And so, the experience has been challenging, but I will say well worth it, just to see how much of a difference that you can make.
And going back to that perspective from being a member of the diaspora and living firsthand experiences due to climate change and disaster risk, is that present in the IPCC? Are there a lot of voices from people who've lived this firsthand, or is it a situation, as we see sometimes in other international fields, where the voice of people who are affected or who've experienced are not there?
Yeah. So the IPCC aims to have half of its people come from developing and half from developed. So global north, global south. So we do get some people in there that do have direct experiences. However, we often are overshouted by people that don't have experience. But they have, the academics, and they've studied this, and they can tell you about what intersectionality is. But it's like, yes, I also know the academic intersectionality, but I know the lived intersectionality, as a woman of color, as someone from a lower socioeconomic class, like, and I have this, that to say. So I think it's really about having the confidence to speak up against people who think that they know more than you because they can spout this theory or the next theory or whatever. Well, you can do the same thing, and you also have the experience to add to it.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you say spouting the theory. I think in similar fields, a lot of theory relying on knowledge that you've read, and instead of relying on knowledge that you've lived, is also quite present. It's interesting to see that it's present in your field, where I feel that lived experience has to play a role. How do you ensure that lived experience plays a role?
I think I ensure that lived experience plays a role in making sure, the stuff that I research, the things that I write, is coming from a perspective as to how can this help people. Not I'm doing this just as an academic exercise, but I'm doing this to highlight how climate change is affecting people, and this is how we can assist and make sure that those voices are in there. So one of the pieces that I did was about after a hurricane came through the community of Ragged Island in the Bahamas. And it was the first time that the island was uninhabited since it had ever been settled. This was a huge deal, but it was 74 people. And I remember I wrote the article, I submitted it for peer review, and one of the reviewers was like, who cares? It's 74 people. And I was so taken aback at that. I was like, wow, like you really put that in writing that you could care less. But it really highlighted to me how important it is that we have people that are doing this type of work and that are highlighting the experiences of people that may not be mainstream that you're used to, but that are equally as important.
Indeed, it's interesting because I see that this discourse is happening more and more after a disaster where we're quantifying it like a war. Every time people talk about casualties, they say 30 casualties. I'm like, well, those are people. And climate change, I think, are seeing the thing now. We're so used to big disasters. They're like, oh, only 10. But that's 10 families. That's 10 people's dreams that are lost, etc. So it's interesting that you mentioned that we're starting to decide that it's just not a lot of people. It's not a big deal. And how did that end up? Did you push or what?
Yeah, I pushed. And it got published and it's well cited to show, these are the type of things that happen to communities. And I think, the scale of deaths or the scale of impacts, it's so context dependent because if it's 10 people dying in Florida, it's much different than 10 people dying outside of the US or in another developing country. So there was another thing, it was like hurricane, I forget which hurricane it was, but it came to the Caribbean and then it went up to the States and New York and New Jersey. And that was where all of the media attention was on. And it's like, actually, it had quite a lot of impacts down in the Caribbean. So we also need to pay attention to that.
We talked about a lack of representation from the diaspora, from Caribbean diaspora. Is there also a lack of representation of women in color in climate change? And if so, why? And why do you think that needs to change?
In my experience, there has been a lack. I think that the number of women and women of color in climate change is growing. We're seeing more younger women that are becoming involved. I'm not sure why. Currently, in my set, there's so few. I go to these conferences and I'm the only one, male or female, which is so jarring to be this is such an important topic affecting so many of us, but yet there aren't many of us in this space. But I think, we're seeing interest in it grow amongst the young people. Climate change is an issue, an intergenerational justice issues that has more impacts on the people that are coming behind us. So we're seeing more and more young people step up. And particularly when you bring in the justice aspects of it, we're seeing also communities of color, young women that are becoming active, which I support fully.
Maybe we need, what's that show? It was a show a long time ago. I can't remember the name, but it built having more women who are interested in forensics. So I'm thinking we need that kind of moment in climate change. You concentrate most of your work on adaptation and loss and damage. Can you explain that in layman terms and why is this important for Caribbean islands?
Yeah, so adaptation to climate change are things that you do before the effects of climate change happen. So things that you do to prepare. It's reducing your vulnerability to hurricanes, increasing the building code, trying to move things out of the way, floods, etc. It's thinking about what are our potential risks to climate change and then putting in place measures so that those impacts, when they happen, won't be as bad. Loss and damage, on the other hand, is responding to the impacts of climate change after they happen, right? So something happens, a drought, a flood, you have impacts, building gets washed away, all the agriculture is gone. And then it's okay, how do we recover from this that has happened? Both adaptation and loss and damage are of critical importance for the Caribbean because we are among the most affected by climate change. So, all small islands in the world, including us in the Caribbean and the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, we contribute less than 0.5% of the emissions that are actually causing climate change. So mitigation, which is what we do to reduce emissions, is not as important for us as small islands as it is preparing for the impacts of climate change and responding to them when they happen, and they're already happening. So adaptation and loss and damage are really the climate action that the Caribbean and other small islands are really focusing on.
Cool. And you touched on it a little bit about who's responsible for polluting and who's responsible for climate change and how's that discussion going and what Are there changes in terms of having larger countries who are responsible for much of the polluting, not, I don't know, paying or making sure that there's some sort of payout for the damage that they're doing to smaller countries?
As you can imagine, absolutely not. We see in the United Nations negotiations on climate change, there is this wanting to shy away from talking about historic responsibility, wanting to talk about, okay, we move forward. What are we doing all together? All of the countries need to be doing everything. And really, the developing world has been pushing to say, actually, no, we need to look at who are the causers of this, and therefore who has the responsibility to provide not only the financial resources, but the support that allow those countries that are most affected to be able to respond to climate change. So this is why it's such a fight in the negotiations, because people don't want to accept responsibility, because then it comes with the financial responsibility as well.
Every year there's the Climate Change Conference, and I think you've participated in the past. And, I've been to a UN conference before, I've been to the CSW, et cetera, and I've noticed that interesting things that happen. So there's the formal talks, but there's a lot of side talks, and a lot of the nitty-gritty happens in the side talks. Can you tell us a little bit about the conference and how the discussions that happen in the side panels, and how do they play a role in the formal decisions? Is it still a division?
Yeah. So the climate change conferences, the COPs, have become a huge circus. I've been going to them since 2015. The last one was in Dubai, and it was over 100,000 people. Huge. So the actual negotiations is just one small part of that now. And then you have multiple types of side conversations going on. You have a bunch of side events, which is where we have CSOs, NGOs, everybody that's doing something around climate change that comes. And this is how the numbers have gotten to be so high. And then you also have the side deals going on between countries that are part of the negotiations. And that's where most of the decisions get made. What you see in the negotiations room is really like a planned theater, because they've already figured out what deals are going to be made on the side. And I think trying to influence those side discussions is something that's really challenging, trying to be part of those side discussions. Yeah, COP has become a circus.
Given the COP, what is working when it comes to climate change work? What gives you hope?
Some things are working. I mean, there's the statue of like the politicians arguing, and the seas is coming up over their heads. And sometimes I feel like that's where we're at, because we're in the negotiations and we're arguing over the placement of a comma. And meanwhile, we're having floods and wildfires that are killing and causing so much damage. I will say one thing that gives me hope is that there is now like open talk about climate justice. Like before, you wouldn't hear anyone talking about that. But now it's like part of the narrative is climate justice. And it's helping to show like where the responsibilities lie for those countries that have emitted the most. But what I also see is that the climate justice is now being applied at the subnational scale. So even governments from developing countries that are pointing the finger at the developed world now have to point the finger at themselves and say, actually, what injustices am I perpetuating within my own country? And so when we go in and we do adaptation and loss and damage projects, part of it is to look at the justice implications. And I think it's shedding a light on sort of these big structural inequities that are leading to certain communities that are, more affected by climate change. And it's causing governments to have to look at how to address these broader inequities. So that sort of gives me some hope in the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think can be done better?
Lots can be done better. I think we need to start thinking of all people as people, right? Like it's so easy to dismiss somebody because they're not the same as you. Or it's so easy to not think about, how is this actually going to help people? Or how is this going to make it worse for people? And I think if we bring more humanity into our work, like across the board, across climate change, across whatever it is that you're working in, like these are people. and think of them as you think of yourself and your family and your loved ones, and bring that empathy into it. And I think, my background has really helped me to do that. And I'd like to see more of that.
I'd like to hear more people say that. Yes, bringing the humanity. I've been working in development for many years, and you would think that at the core of development is humanity, but it's very interesting. It becomes numbers and it becomes theoretical. Yeah, we don't think about who's affected. When we're talking about climate now, we're talking about climate justice, but we're talking a lot about climate migration. And people don't understand, a lot of times when we think about environment, people talk about environment as if it's independent, but people are affected by the environment. So it's interesting to hear that. Thank you. What are some of your career highs and lows, and what did you learn from them?
Yeah, I will say some of my highs have been getting opportunities to be on international platforms. So like with the negotiations on climate change, I've been an invited speaker. I've been a moderator for these events that have hundreds of people from around the world. And it's really, good to see the impact that my work has, the interest in it, and the need to highlight voices that are coming from communities that we don't hear from often. I think lows have been within my own country, where you're not seen as an expert because you're from here, right? So, you mean Adelle? They don't recognize that you are internationally renowned. And they would rather have a foreign person come and tell them about something because they're seen as more knowledgeable than you are. And then the foreign person has to be like, well, actually, I'm a holding an L, So that has been a low. That's something that I still struggle with. It's like when your own people don't recognize or value you. So that's really it.
To point out, because I think a lot of us, you were, I think, born and raised in Bahamas. Some people are from the diaspora, and there is a lack of recognition from your own people, as if you're blowing air and you don't have the expertise. Yeah, that can be a low. And you run into that more often than not.
I think that's starting to change a bit, but I've moved on from trying to find validation from people. So now I'm just like, you know what? It's fine. One day you'll figure it out.
In the particular case of Bahamas, it's interesting. Bahamas is highly affected by these climate events, particularly because it's a low-lying Caribbean island. Are there more and more, is there expertise coming out of Bahamas besides yourself, or is that still a challenge?
Yeah, there's more expertise that's coming out. Actually, founded the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas. And I was able there to mentor and guide and work with young researchers. All of them are actually women that, had done their bachelor's or their master's and wanted to do research on this and wanted to do more. And so actually all 5 of them now are pursuing higher education, either doing a master's or PhD. So I actively support and encourage more young people to get into this because we so desperately need it within the region. And it's something that we need to be leading and championing on rather than having outsiders coming in and telling us what to do when it often doesn't work. So absolutely.
And so what's next for you?
What's next for me? I am continuing to focus on adaptation and loss and damage. I think now that I've moved to the States, more so looking at what can be done to help underrepresented communities here in the States. Also looking more broadly international than just to focus on the Caribbean and bringing my insights there. I'm really looking forward to making a bigger impact. And also, the Caribbean is close to my heart. It will always be there. Will always be something that I focus on, but really looking more globally.
Right. And do you have any heroes or people you admire in this field? Who are they and why?
Yeah. I mean, one that I owe my career to is my graduate school advisor, Dr. Robin Leichenko at Rutgers University. It's her who got me into climate change. I was going to focus on sustainable tourism because, tourism is big for us in the region. And she was like, there isn't going to be any tourism if you don't consider climate change. So you need to focus on climate change. And I did. I changed my topic my first year, and I mean, ever since then, it's just been a rocket ship going off. So I absolutely owe my career to that insight. And then, in addition to her, there's a whole group of Caribbean researchers and advocates, part of the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, located throughout the Caribbean and internationally, that are focusing on these issues of justice, adaptation, loss and damage, climate change. And they are a huge source of inspiration for me as well.
Wow, cool. It's interesting. Every choice you've made seems to be very pragmatic. You wanted to do tourism, which is very important for your region, then engineering. And so with climate change, was there a pragmatism behind choosing climate change, or was it more of a passion thing?
Well, at first it was pragmatism because it was a new area, right? So you don't want to go into something that everyone has already done everything in. You want to be in a new area of research. So at first it was pragmatism, because when I started, there was hardly anything on small islands and climate change. So I was like, okay, this is a new field. I can make my mark here. I have experience in at least the island perspective. So that was pragmatic. But then after seeing like what we are up against when it comes to the climate change crisis and what we have going for us, then it became also a passion to be like, listen, this is huge for us and we need to be serious and acting about this.
On that note, what advice would you give to listeners who are just starting out in this field, or perhaps who are tired?
Who are, starting out or tired? I would say reach out to people. I said that network of people that are working on this is so important when you're starting out and when you're in it. To know that there are other people that are also passionate about this, that are also going through challenges, that may have connections to other people, that may, be something that could be able to help you out. I get all kinds of people that reach out to me, and they have no problem doing so. I had a retired professor from an Ivy League who knew nothing about climate change and was like, I have insights and I would like to be involved, and who can you recommend and put me in touch to? No qualms at all. And expecting a response, multiple follow-ups. So if they can be that bold, then we can also be that bold. So I encourage you to reach out to people, get your name out there, and have a thick skin. If, someone doesn't respond or says no, then just move on to the next one.
Thanks for that advice. I always like to end our episodes with a few questions to know you better. So this time, what song brings a smile to your face? What's the last show you binged and loved? And one thing on your bucket list?
Yeah. So a song that brings a smile to my face is the Baby Calm Down. Baby Calm Down. That song that everybody knows. When it first came out, I used to play that for my baby. I have a young baby, and that would calm him down, and he would start dancing. And then the song blew up and got so popular, and so I was away at COP, and they were playing it just in the venue. And it was how hilarious. So that allows me to feel connected to home, even if I'm away. And last show I binge watched was Love is Blind, season 6.
I didn't watch it, but I know all about it because of all of you.
Yes, they're so addictive. You say, oh, I'm just going to watch one, and then you end up staying all they're hilarious. And then one thing on my bucket list, I think, is to have a full month of being completely disconnected. It's just my family. I did that pre-baby just for 2 weeks, and it was delightful. But I would like to do that now with baby for a full month and just not have work, not have the stress, and just chill and relax.
Well, I do hope you do that. Thank you for joining us, Adelle.
Thanks so much for having me.